Hello, and welcome to the March Newsmaker interview series here at Patrick Henry College with Dr. Marvin Olasky. Today we have the privilege of welcoming special guest Michael Ware. Michael is the founder of Public Square Strategies LLC and a leading expert and strategist at the intersection of faith, politics, and American public life. Michael was one of the youngest White House staffers in modern American history. He served in the White House Faith-Based Initiative during President Obama's first term, where he led evangelical outreach and helped manage trafficking efforts. Michael's book, Reclaiming Hope, Lessons Learned in the Obama White House, gives an unvarnished account of faith inside the world's most powerful office. He serves on the national board of Bethany Christian Services, the nation's largest adoption agency, and holds an honorary position at the University of Birmingham's Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. Please join me in welcoming Michael Ware.
Well, thank you, Michael, for coming here.
It's great to be here.
Extraordinary. I mean, when being introduced, mentioning that you're one of the very youngest White House staffers. You are now at the ripe old age of 28.
Yeah.
Which means that when you became a White House staffer, you were 20 years old?
That's right.
Let me ask about that in a minute, but let's go back a little bit further. Grew up in Buffalo.
Yeah.
A very, very cold climate. Do you ever have a desire now to go back and live in Buffalo?
Always. I love Buffalo. It's difficult. So my wife works on international issues, and so I tell her we can move back to Buffalo and she could be a Mountie on the border, right. One of those Canadian Mounties. But other than that, there aren't too many international job opportunities there. But we love Buffalo. Our families are still there. Yeah.
Okay, and grew up in a kind of Catholic home, but not really belief, more ritual. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I tell people my favorite saints growing up were the saints associated with the food I liked. And so St. Joseph's table is coming up, and I liked St. Joseph because of Sfingy, but it's not really the most theologically reflective faith. But, my grandfather would say that it was the Lord who saw him through World War II, and my aunts would pray their rosary. But as a young person, perceiving what I perceived was that it wasn't a faith that everyone seemed Catholic. It was a Catholicism of fish fries and those kinds of things, and it wasn't something that penetrated my heart, certainly. Yeah.
Okay, and your elder sister was actually the evangelist toward you.
She was. She became a Christian a few years before I did and started working on me immediately. It was like a homing missile, and she'd always try and sit me down and go over scripture with me and have conversations, and it actually built up quite an antagonism. Sort of from my perspective, she finally got me to go to her youth group, and I thought, okay, I'll go to the youth group and I'll just get some more ammunition so I can make fun of her and tell her how silly all of this is. And went to the youth group and didn't like it at all. But on my way out of the youth group, a volunteer there, this guy by the name of Joe Vacani.
What kind of youth group was this?
So it was a church-based. So it was a youth group, high school, run by the church that would end up being my church, my sister's church.
Which was?
The Chapel.
Okay.
So it's a church in Buffalo. It's founded by Dr. James Andrews, and is a thriving kind of mega church environment in Buffalo.
And evangelical.
So, yes, evangelical, non-denominational, but the pastors are all trained Southern Baptists, but we're in Buffalo, so who wants a Southern Baptist church in Buffalo? So, so end up at this youth group, and on my way out, this volunteer by the name of Joe Vacani is handing out tracts of Romans, just Romans, no commentary, just Paul's letter, and I took it home and read it again, and it changed my life. 72 hours later, my sister was dropping me off from school, and in her car outside of our house, I told her I gave my life to Christ, and Romans is a perfect antidote to someone who thinks there's no there when it comes to Christianity. You can reject Paul's argument after you read Romans, but you can no longer say that there is no argument, that there is no case, that the Christian faith isn't a holistic view of the world that you must contend with, and I had to contend with it, and I.
So, okay, a holistic view. What really hit you in it, as you recall?
I had felt like I had never heard any of it before. I didn't understand sort of the logic of it. So, we knew that, Easter, that, Jesus died and rose again. Why? Why did they have to have him? Well, the wages of sin is death. Why don't Christians all act like Jesus all the time? Well, it's because I do not do what I want to do, and what does it mean to enter into this life? Well, you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that. And it was that scope that Paul offers in Romans that. As I write in the book, it's a bit of a longer, so I had some introduction to sort of gospel themes through music, and I talk about sort of, and of course, there was a logical argument that engaged me, but it was a move of the Holy Spirit in my life. But yeah, so those were some of the things that sort of moved me.
And you're also becoming interested in politics at this time as well?
Well, so my interest in politics kind of predated all of that. My grandfather was greatest generation, World War II, fought in Normandy, came back, served his community. We weren't a very political family, but civically minded. And so I was interested in politics, frankly, before I was interested in faith. So when I became a Christian, I thought, well, now I have to go to seminary, become a pastor, because what else would a good Christian do? But I had a good pastor, had good people in my life, and decided I wanted to see what it meant to be faithful in public things, what faithfulness looked like in public areas. Part of the reason why that was important to me, when I became a Christian, it was just when we were starting to have sort of the data and the evidence that the American public in general was kind of turning on the Christian faith, that Gabe Lyons' book on Christian came out, Putnam and Campbell's book, Amazing Grace, American Grace came out, that showed that that not just, I think we often talk about how faith influences politics. What was very apparent to me from the moment I became a Christian was how politics was affecting our faith. So when I first became a Christian, I wanted to tell everyone about Jesus. In the Southern Baptist tradition, like we call it, ignorance on fire. I wanted to tell everyone about Jesus, even though I knew very little about him. But and I'd go tell my friends, I want to tell you about something that's happened in my life, and they'd say, oh, so that means you're going to be judgmental now, or does that mean we can't be friends anymore, or are you going to be mean? And that struck this thing that I was very excited about. That was a very positive thing in my life. All of a sudden, came to understanding that for my peers, it was this very negative, oppressing thing, and a big reason for that was sort of the public witness of the faith as perceived in politics.
So when we read, for example, right in Romans 1, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, as you're reading that, you're also, I suspect, thinking politically to some extent, or what difference that makes in what individuals should do, what government should do. How did this all wrap up?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, so frankly, it took a while to when I left the youth group and read Romans, I wasn't thinking about politics. Yeah, so I think a few things changed, right? So I had an understanding of human life as created that had to influence my view on politics. I had a view of compassion and justice that had to infuse my politics, and I had a view that politics could no longer be ultimate. That sort of as is a major theme in my book, that sort of the prime mover in history is not politics and political actors, but Jesus. And so all of those things sort of, but at various stages of my life, and obviously I'm still growing and learning and today. Yeah.
Okay, and so then you go off to George Washington University.
That's right.
Why George Washington University?
It was right in the thick of things.
Okay. So you wanted to be in Washington?
I wanted to be in Washington. Colleges, so I looked at some other schools that were closer, but the price tags were all so inconceivable to me that my basic idea was, if I'm going to do this at all, I don't want to be studying politics in anywhere but DC. And so yeah, I ended up at George Washington University. I visited the campus, and it's right 3 blocks from the White House, 3 blocks from the State Department, and so it was an exciting place to study.
And in your freshman year, you join and actually become a leader in the Young Democrats.
Yeah, the college Democrats.
Okay, so in the college Democrats. So yeah, why gravitated to the Democrats as opposed to Republicans or something else?
Yeah, so I didn't become so I had been a Democrat or affiliated with the Democratic Party before I went to college. A few reasons for that. One, I think clearly it's just a family history. My grandfather was a union guy, so FDR, Democrats. Second, probably my first substantive sort of policy issue in terms of the things that I cared about were civil rights issues and voting rights, and so the Democratic Party spoke often and significantly about things like protecting the Voting Rights Act and advancing racial equality, and so that was attractive to me. And then, I think if I think the time I was born and just the age I was played a factor. If it was 10 years earlier, I might not have been a Democrat. If it was 10 years later, but my political coming of age, and then as I alluded to earlier, sort of once I became a Christian, came at sort of the tail end of the religious right, and sort of I think a firmer sort of coming to terms with the downsides of that movement as opposed to the good things that it brought to our politics and to the national to the nation. And so sort of the stage of the intersection of religion and politics when I was making these decisions kind of led me to the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this is right at the tail end of the Bush administration.
That's right.
You're in Washington. You tell the story about how you go to a hotel for a conference and you find out it's the wrong day, but it turned out providential. Maybe tell people about that.
Yeah, so I was supposed to be leading a group to the Washington Hilton for the Democratic Winter Convention in 2007. And I get to the hotel, and it was my first convention, so I wasn't too shocked when I got there and there wasn't a huge kind of hubbub. I just kind of thought I'd walk around and open a ballroom door and and the convention would be there. But after 10, 15 minutes, I started thinking, well, maybe I better ask somebody, and ask the receptionist, and she goes, oh, honey, that's not for another couple days. And so I'm dejected and embarrassed, and I am leaving to exit the hotel, and Barack Obama is walking through the hotel lobby for meetings the day or two before the Democratic convention, before the winter convention. It was about a week before he announced he was running, and so he didn't have Secret Service around him. There wasn't a huge crowd of folks trying to get his attention. He basically walked directly up to me, and I had followed his career for a number of years. And I told him I wanted to work for him. I said I thought he was probably going to run for president, and that that I wanted to work for him. And he connected me with some staff, and as a 10 months later, I was in Iowa for the Iowa caucus.
So when you met him, was it love at first sight?
I don't know about that. Again, he was someone. He went to the 2004 Democratic Convention where we were nominating particularly religiously inept nominee. So I think John Kerry would say this, but his campaign manager said it publicly, which is that his failure to effectively navigate religious issues was a primary reason for his loss in 2004. But it was at the convention nominating him that Barack Obama talks about the awesome God we serve in the blue states, and talks about the fact that I am my brother's keeper. And so that perked me up a little bit. And then he went to, in 2006, he gave a speech rejecting secularist idea that we should take faith out of our public debates, as he called it a practical absurdity. And so I had seen him in ways that were pretty bold and unconventional, advance a positive vision for faith at a time when there were a lot of negative narratives about faith in this country. And so when I met him in that hotel, it wasn't like if it had been Hillary Clinton walking through the lobby, I wouldn't have had that same conversation. I had a pre-existing sort of. That's why it was so out of all people.
Yeah. So, and there you're following him. He announces. He starts running, and there you are, still a teenager. Much more fun to be in Iowa, even when it's very cold. You're used to that from Buffalo, but much more fun, and more interesting, more educational aspect than just sitting in the classroom.
That's right. Yeah, and so I got out to Iowa about a month before the caucus, I think, maybe a little less. And when you get that close to a caucus, everyone is it's just complete sort of knock on doors, make sure people get to the polls. But after that, after those few weeks in Iowa, I started doing religious outreach pretty early on. As I talk about in the book, I had to, because of a complicated financial issue with my college, I actually left the campaign in January, and fortunately was able to get back on in May. But I was doing faith outreach basically from the start. And yeah, I mean, it's what's with Barack Obama's campaign. It's important to he had such a short history in political office that, unlike not just Clinton but Biden and Dodd and the other candidates in that race, John Edwards, who had run for president before, he didn't have a huge staff, a huge stable of people to pull from, and so it was working on that campaign. If you were responsible, and to be clear, I was an intern on the first campaign, but even at that level, if you were responsible, if you got the job done, if people could count on you, you were able to really be a part be a part of the operation. And so I learned a ton in that experience.
So you're unpaid,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, someone's paying just for the hotel room or food and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I was staying with campaign supporters. So the way it works in political campaigns, if they max out in donations, they could allow an intern to live with them as a way to further contribute. Yeah.
Okay, but still very much a labor of love and enthusiasm and excitement, and then your candidate's on a roll.
Well, right.
And so basically, while still a teenager, you then have, in essence, an invitation to the inner ring, to use C.S. Lewis's.
Right.
I mean, and the reason I say that is because I can just imagine the excitement and temptation. I mean, I had a little bit of that in my 40s, and it was still interesting, and I was a little bit skeptical, more skeptical perhaps than young, but I felt that, and I just, at age 19, age 20.
I think, and I want to sort of be, for a lot of people who get to the White House, it's after decades of sort of strategizing, and so there was a certain part of it where, frankly, I didn't have much time to process. It wasn't something that I had my eye on. I mean, obviously, once you get to October, you start thinking about what might be next. But it wasn't something. When I met Barack Obama in the lobby of that hotel room, I could not even have fathomed what the next 5-6 years of my life would look like. In some ways, that was very helpful. So when I got to the White House, it was very much. Well, first I was in the faith-based office, which meant that I got to work directly with religious leaders and organizations that were serving those in need. So I wasn't in the communications office. I wasn't sort of, my job was working with and representing religious folks. And so that took some of the edge off and some of the things that could have been there. And then the other interesting thing about working in the White House, which is different even from working on the Hill, is that there's a defined time horizon. That you only have a limited amount of time to get hopefully some good work done. And so there's I think there's a healthy pressure and tension involved there.
Yeah, and did you feel a little bit like Cinderella? Or, perhaps as in My Fair Lady, that you wanted to sing, I could have danced all night.
Right.
Tell us about the emotions there.
I was on the street where Barack Obama lived. That's My Fair Lady. Sorry.
Okay. Soon to be a major musical.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, it's hard to. It was an honor and a privilege to work there. You never forget. You can't forget that you're working in the White House. Yeah. You never quite get used to it. But honestly, I didn't have much time to sort of gawk around and sort of. It was very. Remember when we entered the White House, we were in the middle of the greatest economic catastrophe in the last 60, 70 years. We were trying to figure out what a faith-based office would look like. That there wasn't much precedent for. It had only been only operated under one other administration, and so it was. Frankly, there was too much work done to be too kind of googly-eyed about the whole thing.
Okay. So you certainly thought, based on what candidate Obama and then President Obama was speaking, he sounded some biblical themes. It sounds like from the book that you really thought, here's a place where my political goals, my religious goals, it all comes together. Was that?
No. So I think I stayed. I think very early on, Right. So one of the things I came to terms with pretty early on after I became a Christian is that I was never going to be comfortable in politics again.
Okay.
So it was funny. I did an interview with The Atlantic at the end of last year, and sort of the headline and sort of the frame of the interview was, a man in the wilderness, a man without a political home, and as I thought about that, the thought occurred to me that the crisis for Christians is not that we're politically homeless, but that we ever thought that we could make a home in politics at all. And so I certainly felt an affinity for the president. I certainly thought that he had a positive vision for the role of faith in our politics. I think he put an emphasis on important themes, like the fact that people ought to be able to bring their faith to the public square at a time when we were starting to hear increasingly voices saying that faith had no role to play. The fact that he was willing to speak about things like international aid from a faith perspective, but by no means did I sort of go in thinking that we were sort of aligned on everything and that we were in total agreement.
Okay. So one of the interesting things, let me turn now to just ask you to elaborate on a couple of statements in your book. This is on page 116 and 117. President Obama, I'm quoting here, repeated his openness to restrictions on abortion throughout the 2008 campaign. That he never took any action to propose or actively support such a restriction as president suggests that those statements were either little more than political posturing or his intentions were overwhelmed by political calculation and compromises once he was president, end quote. Reflecting on this now, which is it? Either or both? How do you think that through?
So it's. I was talking with a group about this recently, and one of the themes of that chapter. And by the way, this is a chapter. 5 months into his administration, President Obama went to University of Notre Dame to call for reducing the number of abortions in the country. Following from that, there was a multi-year policy process that never led to what was hoped for and what the president had asked for, which was a unified policy proposal, common ground policies on abortion. A theme of that chapter is that pro-life groups never really held the president's feet to the fire on the commitments he made. So when he said that, when he told Christianity Today that he was open to restrictions on abortion, instead of what I think would have been the strategically smart thing to do, which is to, especially after he was elected and when he was in office already, was I would have, if I was a pro-life group, I would have been running ads saying, okay, well, what abortion restrictions will you support? Instead, the pro-life posture was to treat those words as so meaningless as to ignore them. I think a part of what happened was there was an expectation that the pro-life community wouldn't support him if he sought common ground, and he'd lose support on his left flank. And so it was hard to build and see the sort of political incentive structure that would make something like that feasible. Now, I would still argue right at the heart of that sentence was still a commitment that was made. So what were the goals and motivations of making the statement, and could they have been followed up on in a more substantive way?
So your sense still is that that desire on his part was real. It wasn't. You give a choice here that political posturing or overwhelmed by political calculation and compromises once he was president?
I mean, I posed the question because yeah. I mean, it was right. It was what is clear is that it was not followed up on. What is clear is that in the campaign he said that he supported abortion restrictions, and in office not only did he veto the ones that got to his desk, but he never put forth any restrictions. Which if he said he supported some, then you would think that would be an option.
So that was disappointing.
Of course,
to you?
yeah.
Okay. Let me just read one of these other things. In 2014, a government report found that the administration has failed to enforce, not even tried to enforce, the rule regarding federal funding for abortion. The pro-life Democrats in Congress lost their seats defending what turned out to be a lie, that the president's commitment to health care reform would not result in federal funding for abortion. In this case, the Obama administration proved the cynics right.
Yeah.
So just thinking back now, I mean, if the pro-life groups, you're right, I mean, we're anticipating, assuming that it was all a lie, and we're not going to be taken in by it. Mm-hmm. But you're suggesting that actually they should have said, well, what if it's not a lie, and propose something, or...
No. Right, because, there's a in the first case, what I'm arguing for is they should have treated the words seriously and made the administration put forward a policy proposal.
Okay.
In the latter, the policy was not enforced or even enforceable. So no, don't. I want to conflate the two arguments. On that case, look, and we'll see this happen a number of times, where sort of Democrats would respond with great offense and incredulity about any conservative criticism or questioning about so how dare you say that President Obama supports gay marriage until he supported gay marriage, or how dare you say that healthcare will fund abortion until it funds abortion, as the government report, as their own government report laid out. You would think that report would have prompted a major effort to fix the policy to match the president's commitment. This report came out when the administration was still in place, but instead, to my knowledge, media didn't ask. Frankly, there was very little. There was very little activity from pro-life communities. It was kind of like, well, that's kind of overdone with. It was a major. It was a major. Healthcare was. Remember, it wasn't the individual mandate that held up the passage of healthcare in the end. It wasn't any number of policies. The last move that had to be made to get healthcare reform passed was an executive order that made a commitment that federal funds want to go towards abortion. In my view, that means a lot is riding on that being true.
Okay, so the pro-life people tended to think from the start this was all a crock, and so they were not going to really hold his feet to the fire because they didn't think his feet were ever close to the fire. But reporters should have been asking that question then, right? The contradiction between his statement and action, and no one did. No. I take it. Okay. And then, I mean, similar, you mentioned that you spent a lot of time on this whole policy question about the birth control or abortifacient mandate. And with all the time you spent on it, said making it all the more devastating when the wrong decision was made. So tell us a little bit about that devastation. I mean, take us through what that was like, actually, spending all this time and then.
It was something that took up a lot of time, and there was a lot of run up to it, and the sort of the consequences and the political fallout was made clear. So it wasn't, I was not surprised, nor should anyone else have been surprised by the Fortnight for Freedom or by the religious in other words, this was something that was deliberated over. The stakes were made clear. And still, the initial decision out of the gate was made in the way that was, and it almost exactly what was predicted happened. So it was a disappointing moment. And of course, it's something that's still not over. And so there are still court cases now dealing with the mandate. The administration won multiple Supreme Court cases relating to the Affordable Care Act. What they lost were the cases relating to the mandate. And so, I think it was burned bridges might be a bit too far, but it's certainly there were faith groups that had that were more cynical about the administration after that decision was made, even with all of the adjustments and the sort of attempts to clean it up after the fact.
So, I was somewhat disappointed by the way compassionate conservatism that I had been involved in formulating, I suppose.
Right.
I was disappointed by the way it turned out in the administration. And then people who wanted to think well of me, perhaps over well, would say, well, didn't you feel a little used in the process? To which I would tend to respond, well, I never thought it was very likely from the start. This was a hope, maybe, possibly. I'm sure you've gotten that type of reaction too.
Yeah. Well, so I beginning of the last chapter of my book, I reflect on this very question. What is clear is I was serving at the pleasure of the president. I'm proud of much of the work that we accomplished. But for both the good and the bad, the decisions are ultimately made by him. As I say in that chapter, there, reflecting back, there are clearly, I think I write, emails I never should have sent or phone calls I should have made. You go back and you think, had I approached it this way instead of that way, would the outcome have been different? And those are just things right. that you ruminate on. But that at the end of the day, I think, again, because I was in the faith-based office, because my role was kind of as a bridge between the administration and the faith community, I was in some ways protected from some of the more, in some ways, some of the more complex sort of questions. In other words, I wasn't the person who was signing off on or writing the mandate, or I wasn't the person who that wasn't my role. My role was primarily in outreach and in making sure that the views of the faith community were represented.
But did it end up really increasing the total of cynicism in the land? Insofar as people who had, probably utopian hopes learned that there is no utopia there? Well,
if they had utopian hopes, then those were going to be disappointed regardless. In other words, I'm not sure that cynicism, that politics will effectuate utopia is a bad kind of cynicism to have. I think politics is about you take two steps forward and take one step back, and so I'm sure that I'm not more cynical, sort of coming out coming out of the process, coming out of the last 8 years. But yeah, I don't know how other people have reacted.
So now, Chris Hayes in MSNBC said that he was troubled by presidential misleading, particularly about same-sex marriage and so forth. In fact, he made the analogy of a conservative libertarian saying, well, I'm for the minimum wage when he's actually against it. He would say, I would feel that like that was duplicitous, that fundamentally people had been had.
Yeah.
So when it comes to that particular issue, as you say, that there may be some ambiguity concerning abortion, but concerning same-sex marriage, I mean, it's very clear that, in fact, there was lying going on.
Right. Yeah.
And so do you feel you were had on that?
I mean, I don't really, it's really not a personal sort of thing. What I feel is that if we accept politicians lying, not being clear about their positions as a political strategy to advance our ends, then we undermine, that is a cause for cynicism. That is a cause for people to feel like, how can I even be a citizen? How can I engage in politics when you're putting the burden on the voter, not on the politician? You're putting the burden on the voter to discern in which case and in which scenario politicians are telling the truth or not, instead of putting that burden on politicians. So the troubling thing for me about that was not that the president changed his mind, if there was a change of mind that took place. The thing that was people applauding sort of how astutely the change happened and how aides have come out saying it's a major part of his legacy that this change happened when he ran in 2008. And as I talk about in the book, it wasn't just that he was going to religious groups and saying that he supported the traditional definition of marriage. 3 days or less than a week before the election, he was on MTV telling a bunch of teenagers, which generally support gay marriage. He was telling them, "I support marriage between a man and a woman." So it was a clear part of his campaign, and it's just something that we need to confront and reject, whether it advances our policy goals or not. We can't accept that it's okay to mislead the public if that's indeed what happened. And the only sort of evidence that we have for this is David Axelrod wrote a book in 2014, I think, that said that the president had believed in marriage, that had supported gay marriage at least as early as, I think he said, 2007. The White House press secretary didn't deny it, but if the president writes in his memoir, or if the president says publicly that Axelrod's book is wrong, then that's a whole other thing. But since they haven't done that, just the fact that the question is hanging out there in the public is a significant one.
So that is troublesome.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Questions from any of you? I mean, here's an opportunity to find out from someone who was, in the administration, what was going on.
Two questions. What did you never? At least I never hear about the president and his family attending church, regardless of what president it is. Did he attend church? Did the Obamas go regularly to church?
Do you want to ask your second question, or?
The second question is the faith-based office today. What is going on there
Great.
now?
So on the first question, so I tell the significant part of a chapter to talk about that question. The president and the first family attended church. They did not choose a church in D.C. There are a number of reasons for that. I talk pretty extensively about not just the burden on the White House and Secret Service is secondary. It's the burden on the church that is really so. For instance, the president went to church during the transition in 2000. I think it was late 2008. And he went to 19th Street Baptist Church, which is a traditionally African-American church. The news leaked the Saturday evening. Somehow someone found out, someone told a reporter, and it was on WashingtonPost.com, and so, or it was tweeted out, whatever. The news got out. I get to the church to staff the president the morning of the church and the church service, and there's a long line at the magnetometer. So if the president's going to church, the members of the church have to arrive hours early so that they could be screened through magnetometers to get into their church. The lines of the magnetometers were all folks who go to that church, and inside the church was half full of white guys in khaki shorts and Hawaiian T-shirts and flip-flops. You could tell that they weren't regular attenders. And so there are all kinds of sort of structural issues. The president did enjoy going at Camp David. There's a chapel there. So there's a chaplain, Kerry Cash, I believe was his name. And that was obviously a more private, intimate sort of environment. So they went to church like George W. Bush, like Reagan. They didn't have a church in D.C. On the second question, on the Trump faith-based office, it doesn't exist right now. So President Obama announced his plans for the faith-based office when he went to the National Prayer Breakfast 2 months into his first term. Donald Trump went to the National Prayer Breakfast. It didn't mention the office once. So we're still waiting to see. There's no staff there, to my knowledge at this point. But the position does not need to be confirmed by the Senate, and so he could announce someone today, and they would be able to start tomorrow. But they haven't done anything with the faith-based office yet.
See, there was another hand up.
Hi.
I'm curious about if you were doing it all over again and you still cared a lot about civil rights,
Yeah.
but you also care about abortion, and is there still room in the Democratic Party for an evangelical?
Well, I'm still a Democrat, but 2016, which we may talk about, it's getting tighter and tighter, and these things are always ebb and flows. When we lost in 2004, the party realized they had a significant problem, and it opened back up in a proactive way to religious folks. It's when you register for a political party, there's no fine print that says I hereby cede my conscience to whatever the political platform says at the moment. We participate in political parties to influence the party, not for the party to influence us. Now, that is not happening in practice. So we have the highest political polarization in this country that we've ever had. A 2014 study came out of Stanford to show this, that measured political polarization. One of the interesting data points they found was in the 1960s, parents were asked, who would you not want your child to marry? And parents said, I would not want my child to marry someone of a different race, and I would not want my child to marry someone of a different religion. In 2014, the same question was asked. If the parent was a Republican, I would not want my child to marry a Democrat. If the parent was a Democrat, I would not want my child to marry a Republican. So political polarization is seeping into how we, not just our politics, but into the way that we organize our very lives, our social relationships, and it's a significant problem. Part of the way that we fix that is not by withdrawing from the political parties, but by investing in political parties and challenging them from the inside. So we have the highest number of political independents in this country that we've ever had. 43% of Americans are political independents. And then we wonder why our political parties are so extreme. Well, the reason why is everyone who disagrees with anything in the party platform has left because because the party doesn't fit them. Well, the party's not meant to fit you. You're meant to contribute your voice to an institution, to the institution of a political party in a party-based system of government. And so there is certainly I am not committed to being a Democrat for life, but I'm a Democrat now. And I think that there is room, and frankly, we need more who are willing to proudly say that they're Democrats and yet challenge the party where it needs to be challenged.
Are there elected pro-life Democrats that you can point to, or that you can say, this encourages me because I see these young people who are pro-life Democrats and they actually see a way forward? Yeah,
so I'll tell you, there's an organization in Atlanta called the AND Campaign. They're just incredible people.
What's it called?
The AND Campaign.
Okay.
And I think they're going to have a growing presence over the next season. As far as elected officials, we have a number of Democratic senators who have rejected the Democratic Party's call to repeal the Hyde Amendment, who are up for re-election. So Senators Casey, Heitkamp, Manchin have Joe Donnelly in Indiana have been willing to speak out and stand up within the party. And I'm hoping we don't lose them, because we could use more like them. The governor of Louisiana is a pro-life Democrat, but it's important. So 2006, because we were so because Democrats were out of power, because we had lost 2 straight elections, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee intentionally recruited candidates in conservative districts that were pro-life and did have a sensitivity to cultural social conservatives. The parties, and we had dozens of pro-life members as a result. There aren't that many. We've lost a lot of pro-life Democrats in the House, especially over the last 6-8 years.
And that was a successful strategy in 2006. And normally in American political history, when you see a successful strategy, parties want to do more of it. And so what's strange about this is, it seems to me that if the Democratic Party were either pro-life or at least not radically pro-abortion, then Democrats would have won in 1980, in 2000, I think in 2016. So what is there that keeps the Democratic Party from doing what political parties normally do, trying to adjust to win?
Well, so Mark Shields, who's a political columnist, says that you could tell the health of a party by whether it's searching for converts or whether it's searching for heretics.
Okay.
And so part of what has happened is when a party gets in power. Now we haven't had Congress for 6 years, but we've had the White House, which covers a whole lot. There's an ideological calcification that goes on. The same thing happens when the Republicans are in control. That's just something that you would hope that parties would see this historical trend and say, "Wow, we better build up some safeguards so that we don't get so insular and thinking that we're on the right side of history." But that hasn't been the case. When you're in power, the people who are your friends, who are going to be with you 100% of the time, get affirmed, and the people who break with you sometimes, and I'm speaking from like the mind of just the sort of, again, the incentive structure that's put in place. People who maybe are only with you 80% of the time get are not as trusted and not as valued.
Yeah. Other questions? Let me ask, like thinking there was a change in language early in the Obama administration, and I think maybe Hillary Clinton was the first to do it. Instead of talking about freedom of religion, she and then others started talking about freedom of worship. Huge difference. Tell us about the thinking there, what went on internally in discussions about that.
Yeah, so this is one of those things that is actually, in my view, a little bit of a myth, a little overblown. Judd Birdsall, who worked for the Commission on International Religious Freedom in both Bush and Obama administrations, wrote for Christianity Today, kind of debunking this. You can look up and find quotes of politicians saying freedom of worship, including President Bush. But both Hillary and President Obama have also used freedom of religion. I think they're not reading as much into it as sometimes we are. But yeah, that's one of those things I don't think is the reason why religious freedom, particularly conservative religious freedom advocates talk about it is not because they're concerned about the language, but because they're making a point that religious freedom can't be confined to what happens inside the church. And so there is certainly, I am not trying to dismiss that sort of thematic concern. I would just say that the concern about whether politicians are using freedom of worship or freedom of religion, that doesn't always speak to the accuracy of sort of their views.
Okay. I see you're on the board of Bethany Christian Services, which I'm glad to see. My wife and I are one child we adopted when it was through Bethany, and they did a great job. What's happened with adoption, and particularly you go back a few years, then you saw that in Boston and Chicago, Catholic Charities had to close their adoption. Any opportunity now, do you think, to be able to reopen that for the good it does?
No, I mean, because it was a state-based decision, so it's hard to see those states going back. I mean, adoption was one of the policy areas I worked on in the White House, and I was very proud that the adoption tax credit was made permanent. I know you'll be talking with Janet Vestal Kelly, or maybe you already have.
On
but
Monday,
Janet's a good friend and a good leader. Up until the adoption tax credit was made permanent, what you'd have was, these last-minute tax compromise deals right before everyone leaves for the holidays, and it wouldn't be until then that parents would be able to know that, or prospective adoptive parents would know that the adoption tax credit was even going to be available for them. So how do you, if finances are a concern, how do you take the step of starting the adoption process if it's going to take Congress until the final hour to decide whether the tax credit's going to be there? And thankfully, that's no longer the case. Adoption tax credit is there for folks. So there's been some important progress. We've seen amazing collaborations between government and churches in places like Colorado and places like California, in states like Tennessee now, and then because of Janet, largely due to Janet, in states like, commonwealths like Virginia, to reduce the foster care rolls. And so the adoption movement is and there are some challenges, but overall, it's a pretty exciting time to be thinking about and working on and supporting adoption efforts, because a lot of progress has been made.
And Democrats can come on board with that in a way that's they wouldn't do in other things, but as far as that particular pro-life activity.
Well, yeah, and right, and so it's interesting. So there's so if you're talking about post-adoption services or Title IV, it'll be Democrats that are kind of dragging Republicans along with them, and then if it's other, so I think there's actually a really healthy adoption is advanced by that sort of healthy tension, and part of it is because adoption is you can't do adoption without government, you can't do adoption without families, without the fundamental institution of the family, and so it pulls on both the sort of streams of political thought.
So we have to think through ways to bring other streams into a river.
Right.
So anyway, well, thank you, and please join me for thanking and praying that, in fact, on issues like this, Democrats and Republicans can actually work together, maybe some other things as well. Please join me in thanking Michael for coming today.
Great.